Hey there. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to share with you today a bit of a paper that I wrote for my master's in counseling program about healing and the function of healing and how the moon relates to the archetype of healing and can help us understand that. So I'm really excited to share this with you because I've been wanting to share sections of this paper for a little while, but the timing just hasn't synced up, and now here we are. And so the purpose of writing this paper is that it was sort of a culmination piece for my practicum process. That's a requirement of my MA in counseling program. So I am in training to become a licensed therapist, and so a part of that is getting your master's in counseling psychology. And during that process, when you're in school, you need to do what's called a practicum, where you get a certain number of hours seeing clients under supervision. And so I've done that for the last year, and I have completed my practicum as of this week, which is very exciting. And so throughout this process, we have had to write different papers on how we are applying the theories that we're learning to our clinical work, and how we're deepening our understanding through the lived experience of seeing clients. And so this paper, the prompt is was on writing about healing and the healing function. What is it? How does healing happen? Etc. And so it was kind of like the culmination. It's the final paper that I will have written about my practicum work, my practicum experience. And so it feels very fitting to share that with you the week that I have completed my practicum, which is very exciting, quite a milestone, and have learned a lot. So I'll share some sections with you here, and I wanted to also kind of go through my process and talk out loud about it, because it was a tough paper for me to write, and I'll share with you why. But before I start, disclosure, I am not a licensed therapist. I am, like I said, in school on the path of becoming a licensed therapist, but I'm not a licensed therapist. This topic may feel therapeutic, but it is not therapy, and it cannot substitute for professional medical or psychiatric care. So if you feel like you need some extra support, definitely seek that out and find a licensed therapist to support you. All right, so when I first started to write this paper, I wanted to start with defining what is healing. What do we mean when we say healing? I think we throw that word around a lot and we know what it means, but before I wrote this, if you asked me to define what it meant, I don't know, I wasn't really sure how to articulate that. And so I wonder, for you, how would you define healing? And leave me a comment below. And I'm very curious, how do you know that healing has happened? What's involved in healing? What does it look like? Okay, now I'll read. So, healing as relational wholeness is the title. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defined healing as to make free from injury or disease, to make sound or whole, to make well again, to restore health, to restore to original purity or integrity. The etymology of the word heal tracks back to the Old English word hal, or whole. This understanding of the healing function as a process of moving toward wholeness is reminiscent of Carl Jung's idea of individuation. Jungian analyst Marie Stein, in Jung's Map of the Soul, said, "Wholeness is the master term that describes the goal of the individuation process." Stein explained that the process of individuation describes psychological development over one's lifetime, where one gradually becomes more unified, but also a unique personality, an individual, an undivided and integrated person. From this understanding, healing in psychotherapy involves a person developing into themselves as an individual. However, this concept of healing has developed from a white, Eurocentric, westernized cultural context that emphasizes self-reliance, individuality over community connection, purity, and monotheistic religious values. This view of healing as purity and individualized wholeness is not always conducive to working in diverse and marginalized populations. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, because when I started looking into how do we define healing, I was kind of surprised that it was very emphasized, like it all kind of oriented around this idea of wholeness. And that, I don't know, that sound, like the theory sounded like it made sense to me, but in my clinical work, that didn't, I don't know, there was something that was just like missing. And then especially this idea of individuation as like as a way to understand healing. Again, like it made sense to me, but then from a cultural context, it didn't really line up, especially if we're working with which I was working with a lot of communities where the cultural context is more about community and family, not the person in themselves. So I go on to say here, based on my clinical experience working with culturally diverse youth, I view healing as a phenomenon of relational wholeness versus individual wholeness. Healing involves moments of relationally connective experiences that reduce suffering while restoring a sense of connection to something greater than one's individual self. From my perspective, healing involves a sense of satisfaction, completeness, and even wholeness. But that wholeness emerges from interdependence and relationships inside and outside the counseling room. Healing at its core is a relational phenomenon. So I wonder how this sits with you. Does this make sense to you? Do you disagree? What comes up for you when I share this? So that this healing is a process of connection, like connection of a person to themselves, connection of a person to others, connection to the divine or something greater than themselves. That was like those experiences that involve those things. That was where I had this felt sense of healing happening in a person's life and in the room. Okay, so I'm going to get to the astrology part. Healing is an archetype and the moon. But I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but so my practicum site where I had been doing my clinical work, I was working at two different schools. I worked at a middle school and an elementary school, which was super fun. So I did counseling with young people, with kids, and I learned a lot. And I think that it really, like, it opened my eyes to how simple but not easy healing can be. Like it was very like it was like very simple things that fostered experiences of that I would consider like healing experiences. And when I say healing, I'm thinking experiences where a person feels seen, they feel heard, they feel comforted, they feel more connected. They feel like someone sees them and cares about them, and then that in itself, like that is what evokes change. So for me, it's like a very relational process, a very tender process, and very vulnerable too. Like it's very vulnerable to be seen for the way that you are and to open yourself up to that. Healing as an archetype. Okay, pause. So an archetype, when I use that word, archetype essentially means an archetype is a symbol that involves patterns that repeat over time. So it's kind of like a collection of symbols that are oriented around a common concept, and we see those symbols repeating in different ways, in different time periods, in different cultures, and in different places around the world. So a common archetype may be like the mother archetype, the father archetype, the child archetype, the warrior archetype, things like this. I hope that makes sense. All right, so from an archetypal perspective, the relational phenomenon of healing can be seen in the planetary archetype of the moon. Cultural historian Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche called the moon the great mother goddess, together with aspects of the child constituting the relational matrix of life. And I just love that term, the relational matrix of life. I thought that was like very like, oh yes, this is what I'm talking about. This symbol of the moon informs my understanding of healing as the creation of a nurturing, reflective, and empathetic holding space that mimics a maternal nature. Counseling and healing work is inherently connected to the planetary archetype of the moon for its correlations to emotions, early childhood experiences, and relational experiences. Indian Vedic astrologer Camilla Sutton in The Essentials of Vedic Astrology explained that the moon in a person's birth chart is a symbol of their mind, emotional temperament, their mother, and the nature of one's relationships. She said, the moon's representation of the mother also shows the relationship she will have with her offspring. This relationship inevitably has a powerful influence on the child later in life. From this perspective, healing is not only relational in general, but also draws one back into the initial relationship with their maternal figures, with their caregivers. From this archetypal understanding, the process of healing involves recreating maternal experiences that are encouraging of the client's temperament and developmental process. So I wonder what that brings up for you. And how does that land with you? The more I was thinking about the moon what was I thinking? I was kind of like trying to imagine how we see healing for a person when we're looking at their astrology. Do we see it in the natal chart? Do we see it in transits? What planets or aspects or houses would we be looking at? And I just kept going back to the moon because the moon is about this holding. It's about the early holding environment. And I think I've done a video and a podcast where I mentioned this a bit, where the moon is like really in your chart. It's a symbol of how you experienced your early holding environment, your early childhood, and your caregivers. And so that nurturing environment is the feeling tone quality of healing, at least in my experience. so far. And the moon has this symbolism around healing and nurturance and being seen, being validated, receiving what it is that you need in order to feel safe and secure. And I think too, the fact that I was working with youth, that I was working with kids, like 15, anywhere from like 15 to like 7. You know, this is a time where there's a lot of growth that's happening, and even though they're not in that early holding environment anymore, but you know, the early years, they're progressing, there's still this element of like needing to figure out who they are by being mirrored and validated and getting that feedback, and being able to like test out boundaries and being able to relate and connect to someone from a place of like, from a place of, how do I say this, like from like an unbiased space. And I think that was one thing that I noticed that was really interesting to me, is that so many of the kids that I worked with, they really got value out of having someone there that would listen and was curious and didn't try to tell them what to do or how to be, or try to, you know, like convince them to do, you know, do something one way or the other. And I know that sounds very simple, but it is not common, especially at school. You know, at school they have to be on task and complete all their projects and things like this. And so I think this archetype of healing of the moon, the planetary archetype of the moon, facilitated this process that was helpful for them to feel that mirroring, so that they can figure out who it is that they are. Okay. Also, full disclosure, I am coming at this from the perspective of a person who does not have kids. And so like I'm like want to acknowledge that I'm holding that, and that I think my experience would be much different if I were doing this and I had kids of my own, especially in this age group. I don't know what my experience would be, but I think it would definitely, I think I would be looking at things differently. Okay, so there's a bit more that I'll read here. So Dr. Kalsched, in Trauma and the Soul, a psychospiritual approach to human development and its interruption, said that psychoanalysts have begun to realize what has been broken relationally must be repaired relationally. And so here he was talking about trauma, and saying that when there was a trauma that was relational, which most are, that it must be repaired relationally, not the person individually doing work on themselves, that it is a relational process. He goes on to say, this is right brain to right brain communication. The therapist tunes in on an affect level to those dissociative gaps or places of derailment where the intimate feeling connection with the client threatens to come apart. And so this to me was also like a very moon archetype, because the moon is about our intuition, our gut feeling, and our ability to sort of like tune into what is going on from a feeling level or an intuitive level. And here he was talking about, this is an excellent book, by the way. I'll put my references down below for you to check out. he's talking about how in therapy, and I think even outside the therapy room, we've discovered that there are these things called mirror neurons that that allow people to unconsciously sync up with one another. And we can see this happening in the room where people start to like unconsciously mirror each other's body language. But they can see it like in the brain as well. And so that there's like this syncing up, and it involves a right brain to right brain connection, because that is the part of the brain that is more spatial and I guess it's like more of an unconscious connection versus a conscious linking up. I hope that makes sense. The book goes into it in much more detail in a way that is more articulate than I'm explaining right now, but I hope you get what I'm saying, is that there's this unconscious link. There's like this psychic link that happens, and I think this can happen again outside of any kind of therapy or treatment kind of work, where you kind of can like tune into people, certain people more than others maybe. And so what he's saying here is that in therapy, that process, that like linking up is relational, and it is a part of the healing, especially for trauma. And so this struck me as well, in that like this is very moon, because the moon is about our ability to be intuitive and empathic, and to connect without knowing the logistics, without knowing the details. Okay, so I'll read you this last part. In my clinical work thus far, I have witnessed the healing effect of therapy through relational moments of wholeness that my clients have experienced in connecting to themselves, to another via the therapeutic relationship, and in connecting to something greater than themselves. I've found vulnerability to be a common occurrence in these healing moments. Individuation and self-actualization theories inform my understanding of healing, while I hold that cultural relevance often shifts the focus from an individual to a relational emphasis. I also am inspired by the planetary archetype of the moon as a symbol of the healing process through maternally toned interactions in therapy. Finally, I have experienced healing in myself. In working with this population, I feel that I am reaching back into time to give myself the mirroring, authentic presence and care that I deeply craved at that phase in my own life. So I wonder how this lands with you, if it resonates or not, and what does, and what thoughts you might have about healing and your own process as well. My name is Shauna McGrath. I'm an astrologer. If you want to find out more about me and my work, get a reading with me, take classes with me, you can find more information on my website, shaunamcgrath.com. I would love to work with you and get to know you better. I hope you have a lovely day, and I'm wishing you lots of safety, health, wellness, and ease. Bye for now.